Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight's journey isn't through the ruins of some crumbling empire or the aftermath of a medieval battle. No, tonight we'll be taking a slower, stranger path. Through mead halls and monasteries, through plague-ridden villages and candlelit cells, we're going to explore all the ways medieval people managed to get high, on purpose, by accident, sometimes while praying, sometimes while dying, and almost always without the faintest idea of what they were doing. Before we sip the ale, chew the bread, sniff the resin, and smear the ointment, do me one small favour. Let me know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there. It's so lovely to see who's tuning in from around the world. And if you'd like early access to more of these sleep-friendly historical spirals, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, you'll find the Patreon link in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable, maybe wrap yourself in a weighted blanket for that slightly crushed, deeply calming feeling. I'll leave a link to the one I use in the description. Let's begin. Daily life in the Middle Ages is not romantic. It's not all illuminated manuscripts and candlelit prayer. More often, it's cold feet, infected teeth, bad stew, and too many questions about sin. Most people don't own anything. Most people can't read. Most people are in pain. If you break a bone, you might limp forever. If you lose a child, you bury them and go back to work. If your neighbour claims she saw a demon in the rafters, no one laughs, because sometimes they do appear, and no one wants to be the one who didn't believe. It's not surprising then that people turn to other things, to herbs and brews, to powders and fumes, to roots dug from graveyards or flowers picked under the moon. Sometimes it was medicine, sometimes it was ritual, sometimes it was just to feel something different. A little relief, a little distance, a little magic, even if only for an hour. You don't call it addiction because there is no such word. You don't call it sin, not unless the priest does. You just know that after the drink, or the smoke, or the root, the air feels lighter, and your thoughts less sharp, and the pain, wherever it lives in your body, goes quiet. And so we begin where everyone did, at the bottom of a mug. In the medieval world, it's not just acceptable to be drunk, it's almost mandatory. Not in the riotous festival sense, but in the quiet, routine way that happens when beer is the only thing that won't try to kill you on the spot. Water is a gamble. Wells go stagnant. Rivers are full of livestock, lepers, and the occasional floating regret. Beer, on the other hand, is boiled, fermented, slightly alcoholic. In other words, safe-ish. What passes for beer is often thick, flat, warm, and mildly suspicious. It tastes like the inside of a grain sack, and sometimes comes with a bit of grain still floating in it. If you're lucky, it's been strained. If you're not, you chew. But it fills the stomach, doesn't rot your insides. And unlike wine, you don't need a patron or a vineyard to make it. You just need barley, water, patience, and a tolerance for disappointment. Everyone drinks it. Children are given small ale, watered down, weak, more of a broth than a brew. It's not indulgent, it's survival. Infants sip it with porridge. Toddlers slurp it at midday. No one questions it. Milk goes bad. Water is treacherous. Beer is consistent, like mud and death. For working adults, the beer is stronger. Not enough to knock you down, but enough to make the day slightly less unbearable. Peasants drink before field labour. Stonecutters drink before lifting anything heavier than a chisel. Fishermen drink before remembering they don't actually like fish. The drink doesn't improve the work, but it makes complaining about it more rhythmic. Monasteries elevate the process. Benedictine monks in particular take brewing seriously, because God, like everyone else, appreciates a decent pint. Recipes are refined, documented, debated. The result is smoother, darker, stronger ale. Not out of vice, of course, out of holiness. During Lent, solid food is forbidden. Liquid, however, is not. Somewhere along the line, a monk realised that if you make your beer thick enough, It qualifies as a meal, a spiritual one. In some cloisters, monks consume up to 3 gallons of liquid bread a day, not as punishment, as fasting. The loophole is theological. The result is impressive. Monks stumble slightly during Vespers. Chanting slows. A novice tries to light a candle that's already burning. No one speaks of it directly. They just give thanks and quietly refill the tankard. The nobility drinks for entirely different reasons, most of them theatrical. At court, wine is preferred, imported, perfumed, stored in cellars deeper than some moats. But beer and mead flow freely as well, especially among the less polished branches of aristocracy. Drinking is a performance, complete with rituals of toasting, competitive gulping, and the occasional spontaneous duel. Feasts begin orderly. They rarely end that way. It's not uncommon to see a minor lord slumped into a plate of roast pigeon, or a knight trying to joust a tapestry. Slurred poetry is recited. Marriage proposals are made, retracted, and made again. Every now and then someone ends up married to the wrong person entirely. The church frowns, but not too hard. Everyone involved is tithing. Drunkenness isn't admired, but it isn't exactly condemned either. It's tolerated, expected even, especially from nobles, monks, and anyone else whose decisions can't easily be questioned. A peasant passed out in the mud is a warning. A baron passed out on a velvet bench is tradition. At the centre of all this is the alehouse. Every village has one. It may be no more than a lean-to with a fire and a barrel, but it serves its purpose. The alehouse is a social balm, a place where grievances soften and gossip ferments. People gather after long days of repetitive agony to drink slightly less awful beer and hear slightly worse versions of familiar stories. Music is played sometimes against its will. Laughter is rare but real. Fights are rarer. Everyone's too tired to swing with purpose. Beer is also a useful anaesthetic, primitive, blunt, and unmeasured. Midwives offer it to labouring women. Blacksmiths give it to apprentices before cauterising wounds. Barbers pour it into patients with broken limbs and cracked teeth. There is no standard dosage. The patient drinks until they stop caring. In this world, sobriety is not a moral high ground. It's a health risk. Being stone cold sober means being fully present in a body that hurts, in weather that bites, under laws that don't like you, while facing a future with more ploughing than payoff. Alcohol dulls that knowledge. It doesn't solve anything, but it slows the dread. And that's worth something. The church is aware of all this. It preaches moderation. It condemns excess. And then it promptly returns to the cloister, where the beer is thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Monks know better than most how hard it is to get closer to God while fully conscious. Drunken chanting may not be dignified, but it's often more honest. Even saints aren't immune to the logic of the mud. Pilgrims carry ale in flasks strapped to their belts, praying for miracles and drinking to forget the blisters. Relics are venerated by the faithful, many of whom smell faintly of hops. No one complains. Piety and pint go hand in hand, provided the pint is locally brewed and the priest hasn't had to drag you out of a drainage ditch recently. Of course, the drink is not always safe. Bad batches happen. Improper fermentation, mouldy grain, accidental additions of herbs better suited for poison than pleasure. There are stories of ale that causes blindness, paralysis, or spontaneous public singing. Still, people keep drinking because water is worse, because sobriety is worse, because beer, however unpredictable, is familiar. So the world drifts forward in a haze of barley and resignation. Peasants raise their mugs before lifting the plough. Nobles fall asleep mid-toast. Monks sway in candlelight, full of theological loopholes and warm grain. The liquid may vary, but the logic does not. Drink to dull the ache. Drink to mark the feast. Drink to survive the fast. Drink because it's the only thing anyone can afford to believe in. Of course, Not every altered state is welcomed or intended. In a bad harvest year, and there are many, bread becomes something of a gamble. Grain is scarce, storage is poor, desperation is high. People bake what they have, and what they have isn't always safe. Rye, the bread of the poor and the stubborn, stores moisture a little too well. And where there is moisture and darkness, something else grows. Ergot. To the naked eye, infected rye just looks a bit off, a little darker, a little misshapen. Maybe it smells slightly musty, but that's hardly alarming when everything else already smells like mildew and wet straw. People grind it, bake it, and eat it, because the alternative is hunger. And hunger, in the medieval world, is never just a nuisance. It's an accomplice to death. The fungus doesn't announce itself right away. It waits. It travels from oven to stomach to bloodstream, in silence. But once it begins, it does not arrive quietly. The first symptoms are subtle, a tingling in the fingertips, a numb patch on the foot, an odd sensation behind the eyes. Then come the cramps, the twitching, the limbs that begin to jerk like puppet strings pulled by an impatient hand. The neighbours notice, the priest notices. Soon the screaming begins. Some collapse, unable to control their own bodies. Others begin to see things, glorious, terrifying, and completely unrelated to anything in their field of vision. Angels descend in golden flame. Demons claw through the thatch. Dead relatives appear to deliver cryptic messages, most of them unhelpful. Entire villages start to look like poorly organised exorcisms. The technical term is ergotism, but no one calls it that. What they call it depends on what they already fear. Some say it's possession. Others say it's divine punishment. The priest calls it a test. The healer calls it a curse. The woman down the road says it's because someone let a cat sleep on the grain sacks. Everyone agrees that someone, somewhere, is to blame. The symptoms split into two grim categories. In one, the afflicted hallucinate with all the clarity of a stained glass fever dream. They shout prophecies, strip naked in the square, dance until their legs give out, then stare blankly into the sun and insist they see God's teeth. This form, oddly, is the less fatal one. The other type is quieter but crueler. It starts in the toes. The blood vessels constrict. The skin goes pale, then blue, then black. Fingers fall off. Noses, ears, feet rot while still attached. The victim feels cold even in midsummer. The pain is immense until it isn't. By then it's already too late. Gangrene has no reverse gear. In towns and hamlets across Europe, outbreaks of ergot poisoning become part of the seasonal anxiety. No one really knows what causes it, but the pattern is familiar. Wet harvest, strange bread, and then a sudden wave of villagers writhing in the fields or preaching from rooftops. No one trusts the grain, but no one throws it out. They can't afford to. The church responds with its usual toolkit: prayer, relics, and relocation. Pilgrimage hospitals begin to appear, especially those under the name of Saint Anthony. He becomes the unofficial patron saint of involuntary breakdancing and spontaneous spiritual combustion. These hospitals offer food, shelter, and prayer, and more importantly, they get the twitching people out of the public eye. St. Anthony's fire becomes the polite term. It sounds better than hallucinatory flesh rot, which is admittedly harder to engrave in Latin. The name spreads. So do the symptoms. In some cases, whole villages are relocated. In others, only the afflicted are moved, carried away in carts, arms flailing, eyes rolled back, still muttering about flaming horses and weeping saints. The authorities are baffled. Physicians blame hot bile, clergy blame sin. The occasional herbalist blames wetness of the humours, which sounds plausible until you realise it means nothing. No one mentions the bread. Or if they do, they're ignored. After all, it's just bread. Holy daily, blessed by habit. How could it betray them? But betray them it does. There are years when the fungus wins outright. One notable outbreak in 944 reportedly kills 40,000 people in Aquitaine. That number is probably exaggerated, medieval bookkeeping being what it is, but the panic is real. In another case, a convent collapses into collective vision. The nuns experience rapture, terror, speaking in tongues, and an alarming enthusiasm for levitation. It takes 3 priests and a confused doctor to convince them to stop. And still, nothing changes. The grain is ground, the bread is baked, the people eat it. Because they have to. Because a little madness is better than no food at all. They take their chances and hope that this year the saints are too busy to notice. Over time, the outbreaks become part of the folklore. A bad harvest isn't just a threat to the body, it's an invitation to the strange. People begin to whisper about certain fields being cursed, about bread that glows faintly at night, about families who never twitch, even when everyone else does. None of it is proven. All of it is believed. The hallucinations are remembered long after the pain fades. A man claims to have spoken to St. Michael in a barley field. A woman describes an angel with too many eyes who told her to become a potter. A child insists he saw the Virgin Mary holding a chicken. These stories spread, retold at firesides, and in hushed tones during fast days. They are not mocked, they are not questioned. They are simply added to the pile of things no one understands but dares not ignore. For the people who survive, the memories are fragmentary. Some recall only pain, others recall the visions, as real as any day. A few don't recall anything at all, except that afterward, no one would sit beside them at church. The social cost of surviving the rye is subtle but permanent. People nod to you but don't invite you in. They smile but step back. No one blames the bread, not directly, but some villagers begin to pray over their loaves before baking. Others store their grain in different barns or sprinkle ash over the flour. These measures are unlikely to help, but they feel like control. And control is the rarest commodity of all. It will take centuries before anyone understands what ergot is, before anyone looks through a microscope and sees the culprit curled around a rye kernel like a secret. Until then, people will keep eating, keep twitching, keep seeing things they were never meant to see. And somewhere in the midst of it, someone will proclaim it a miracle. Sometimes the poison is a mistake, other times it is an invitation. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, away from courts and cloisters, folk medicine thrives in shadows. The people who practice it are not formally trained. They don't wear robes, carry seals, or quote Aristotle. They carry baskets. They walk the hedgerows. They whisper to plants. They are midwives, cunning women, root diggers, sometimes respected, often feared, and always useful to someone with a toothache, a difficult birth, or an unwanted pregnancy. Their tools are not delicate. They do not possess the polished instruments of university-trained physicians or the silver bowls of noble surgeons. What they have are jars of dried leaves, bundles of bitter roots, and pots of ointment that smell like mouldy soap and salvation. Among their favourites, mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and nightshade, all part of the same deadly botanical family. All beautiful, all toxic, all in the right hands, surprisingly effective. Mandrake shrieks when pulled from the earth, or so the stories say. Henbane smells like a burnt onion and doesn't do much for one's complexion. Belladonna dilates the pupils, induces visions, and in the wrong dose kills without much ceremony. But blended into salves and rubbed into the right places, especially where the skin is thin and receptive, they become something else entirely. This is where the flying begins. The so-called witch's ointment is not used to fly in the broomstick sense, at least not physically. But for the women who use it, something very real happens. The ointment is applied in secret, often to the thighs, the underarms, or other soft tissue. Within minutes, the world shifts, the body grows weightless, sound distorts, thought untethers. Time rearranges itself like a poorly sorted drawer. And then the visions arrive. Some see landscapes that do not exist, forests that glow, meadows full of whispering teeth. Others experience transformation into animals, into smoke, into nothing at all. Many describe attending strange gatherings, dances, feasts, flights. These Sabbaths are rarely coherent. There are demons, yes, but also familiars who talk like old friends, and saints who arrive uninvited. There is food, but it is sometimes bones. There is music, but it often howls. The whole affair has the structure of a dream and the logic of a very bad one. Not everyone has the same vision, but certain patterns emerge. The sensation of flight is common. The feeling of being pulled, lifted, or carried through walls and rooftops. The awareness of distance passed without movement. These are not hallucinations in the theatrical sense. They are immersive, embodied, unforgettable, and they are reported with such detail and with such emotional sincerity that modern researchers have had little difficulty connecting them to pharmacological causes. When a woman insists she floated through the rafters and danced with goats, it is often because, from her perspective, she did. The ointments work, not gently, not safely, but they work. The recipes are imprecise. Measurement is done by sight, taste, or instinct. One batch may induce a dream, another may induce convulsions. The risk is assumed. No one expects these mixtures to be gentle. They are not sipped, they are survived, and yet they continue to be used, quietly passed down between women, sometimes with instruction, more often with caution and a short prayer. Lonely women use them, widows, midwives, isolated figures on the edge of town whose usefulness outweighs the discomfort they cause. Some use the ointment for relief, from pain, from grief, from memory. Others use it for insight. A few perhaps use it for company. The hallucinations may be terrifying, but at least they arrive, at least they speak. The church, of course, is deeply unamused when these women are accused of witchcraft, and eventually many of them are. Their descriptions of flight, vision, and nocturnal feasting are seized as proof. No one considers pharmacology. They consider sin, heresy, contracts with the devil. Confessions are extracted often with the help of persuasion techniques involving fire or sharp metal. The women say they flew. The inquisitors nod. The women say they danced in the air. The inquisitors take notes. Then someone lights a torch. The irony is thick enough to spread on toast. The women are punished for speaking honestly about the effects of their own medicine, which they do because it feels real. Their bodies experienced it. Their minds wandered through it. They returned to the waking world unsure of how much was true, but no less convinced that something happened. They aren't lying. They're remembering. The visions are not invented for drama. They are not meant to shock. They are the internal records of real experiences, processed through the language available. Saints, spirits, sin. A woman who sees a horned figure during an ointment trance has not been seduced by Satan. She has had an extremely powerful chemical experience and is doing her best to explain it in terms the local priest will understand. Unfortunately for her, the local priest doesn't really do nuance. This is where myth and medicine bleed into one another. The witch's Sabbath, as it appears in trial transcripts, is part fantasy, part hallucination, part coerced confession, and part very bad PR. But underneath it is a thread of pharmacological truth. These women were using real plants, creating real substances, and producing very real effects. They were not summoning demons. They were accidentally recreating the chemical conditions of a shamanic rite with the enthusiasm of an underfunded apothecary. Of course, not all of them survived their own recipes. The line between vision and coma is thin when your dosages are measured in pinches and about this much. Some fell into sleep and never woke up. Others woke up confused, half naked in a ditch, still convinced they just finished dancing with wolves. A few became legends, most became cautionary tales. What remains is a strange half-buried record, part folklore, part forensic report. Stories of ointments that made women fly, of powders that sent them beyond the veil, of dreams too vivid to forget and too strange to admit without consequence. When asked later if they really flew, they say yes, without hesitation, and perhaps, in a way that matters, they did. Across the world, others sought altered states not by accident, but with purpose. In the medieval Islamic world, intoxication occupies a complicated space, somewhere between crime, contemplation, and casual afternoon activity. At one end of that spectrum are the Sufi mystics. At the other are bored bureaucrats and amateur philosophers who, having exhausted debate on the finer points of calligraphy, quietly reach for something a little more resinous. That something is hashish. Made from compressed cannabis resin, hashish is smoked, eaten, or otherwise introduced to the system by anyone willing to drift sideways from consensus reality. It is not universally approved, nor is it rare. By the time the Islamic Golden Age is in full bloom, hashish has quietly rooted itself in the cultural landscape. From poetry salons to mountain monasteries to the back alleys of Cairo, where it becomes a kind of social condiment. Add a little, and the world feels gentler. Add a lot, and the world begins to rearrange itself. Among Sufis who already specialize in chasing the divine through movement, breath and verse, hashish is less a scandal and more a possibility. Not all orders use it, and those who do rarely announce it, but it appears often enough in their stories, poems, and occasional medical complaints to leave little doubt. Some treat it as a tool to quiet the self, others as a key to loosen the soul. A few call it mirror, which is fitting, because it reflects exactly what the user wasn't expecting to see. For poets, the relationship is even less ambiguous. Hashish is both muse and metaphor. The altered state it produces is not just chemically useful, it's thematically appropriate. The best lines arrive somewhere between dusk and complete mental disintegration. In garden courtyards and low-lit chambers, verses are composed while laughter bubbles in the background and someone stares a little too long at a decorative tile. The words are profound, though no one is sure why until later, sometimes not even then. Outside the mystical and literary circles, hashish remains divisive. Some Islamic jurists argue that any substance causing intoxication is inherently haram, religiously forbidden. Others note that the Quran specifically prohibits wine, not necessarily everything else that makes people speak slowly and misplace their sandals. The legal debate stretches on for centuries, with scholarly disagreement that grows increasingly philosophical the more everyone smokes. Rulers take a variety of stances, most of them inconsistent. A sultan in one province bans hashish outright, orders the cafes shut down, and demands public floggings for anyone caught in possession. His nephew, inheriting the throne 2 years later, quietly reopens the cafes and has a courtyard pipe installed behind the library. One caliph denounces hashish in the morning, then spends the evening giggling into a plate of dates. Another issues a proclamation forbidding intoxication, dictated, reportedly, while reclining on a cushion and staring into the middle distance. Cannabis clubs begin to appear by the 11th and 12th centuries, especially in cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. These are not dens of crime and debauchery. They are relaxed, often quiet spaces where men gather to recline, converse, and forget about tax assessments. Patrons bring their own pipes. Someone always knows a man with good product. The walls are often tiled, the seating low, the atmosphere reverent. It's not about excess, it's about softening the edges of consciousness until the world becomes tolerable. The hashish itself varies, sometimes sticky and sweet, sometimes brittle and pungent. It is often eaten rather than smoked, folded into pastries or mixed with syrup. The effects take time. Conversations drift. Ideas bloom and wilt within minutes. One man speaks eloquently about the transience of all things. Another can no longer remember how to sit up. Not everyone approves of these clubs. They are periodically raided. The owners are fined or beaten. Pipes are broken dramatically in public squares, as if to warn other ceramic ware of its moral obligations. But the closures rarely last. People return. New clubs appear. The smoke continues to rise, slow, floral, unbothered. Among wandering mystics and dervishes, Hashish takes on a spiritual dimension. The whirling dances, rhythmic chants, and breath rituals blend easily with mild intoxication. A dancer describes touching the edge of heaven during a turn. A singer loses her sense of time and speaks only in riddles for 3 days. The Sufi path is already one of ego dissolution and ecstatic union. Hashish, for some, is just a particularly cooperative travel companion. Of course, the use is not always mystical or poetic. Sometimes, it's just convenient. Soldiers chew it to quiet their nerves. Clerks use it to endure long days of copying records no one will read. A night watchman swears it keeps him alert, though his definition of alert includes talking to cats. It becomes, in some places, the working man's meditation. Available, affordable, and far less fatal than wine. Critics claim hashish leads to laziness, heresy, and moral collapse. In response, supporters point to the moral collapses occurring among people who don't use it. The debate becomes circular. Someone quotes a poet who was high when he wrote it. Someone else dismisses it because the poet was high when he wrote it. The cycle repeats. In literature, the hashish user becomes a stock figure, a dreamy philosopher, a harmless fool, a holy madman. Stories depict them floating through marketplaces, muttering wisdom that sounds absurd until it turns out to be true. They are comic relief, spiritual guides, and occasionally tragic warnings, depending on the author's mood and whether he had access to the good stuff that week. Over time, attitudes harden. New rulers rise with stricter ideas. Courts seek order, clarity, control. The haze of old cafes thins. Laws are enforced more harshly. Public use declines. Hashish doesn't disappear, but it becomes quieter, more private, tucked behind thicker curtains, shared among trusted friends, wrapped in layers of discretion. Still it persists, in whispered poems, in hidden gardens, in the long pauses between sentences. A pipe passed hand to hand, a slow exhale, a moment of quiet in a world that rarely allows it. Hashish is not revolutionary. It does not spark uprisings or upheaval. It simply rearranges the furniture inside one's head. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. It is banned, beloved, and quietly baked, from sacred plants to sacred pain relief. If hashish was the philosopher's smoke, opium was the physician's balm. And like most medieval medicine, it walked a narrow line between miracle and mistake, though it made you care far less about which side of that line you were on. The poppy had been cultivated long before the medieval period, stretching back through Babylonian tablets and Greco-Roman apothecaries. But by the 9th and 10th centuries, it had quietly entrenched itself in the medical cabinets of both Islamic and Christian worlds. Its appeal was simple. Pain hurt. Opium stopped it. That was enough. Physicians in Baghdad, Cairo, Toledo, and Constantinople recorded recipes for powdered poppy seeds, black resin paste, and sleep syrups thickened with honey. In an era where amputation was a legitimate Tuesday activity and most dental interventions involved prayer and pliers, opium was a revelation. It dulled the agony, it calmed the patient. It sometimes stopped them from screaming loud enough to disrupt the neighbours. But opium's real triumph came in the variety of forms it could take. There was poppy milk, steeped and strained into a chalky tonic, popular among monks and new mothers alike. There were teas and infusions favoured by those with nervous disorders or irritable humours. There were syrups made with saffron, mint and sugar, served warm to noble children, too delicate to cope with reality. And then there was the Ergot, a legendary blend of more than 60 ingredients, including cinnamon, honey, myrrh, and just enough opium to make you forget how expensive it all was. It was technically a cure-all. Realistically, it was an elite way to be very gently unconscious. The poor had fewer options. They could not afford theriac or even poppy syrup on most days, but they improvised. Crushed poppy mixed with cheap wine created a concoction equal parts sedative and stomach turner. Some steeped the pods in vinegar, then added ash or soot to cut the bitterness. It worked in the way that jumping into a cold river works. You stopped thinking about anything else for a while. Doctors prescribed opium for nearly everything that couldn't be bled, blistered, or prayed away. Insomnia, melancholy, headaches, grief, hysteria, gout, consumption, heartbreak, it didn't matter. If the patient was sufficiently annoying or noble, opium found its way into the prescription. And because pain was constant and comfort rare, most patients didn't question the effects. They just asked for more. Clergy used it discreetly. So did scholars, who found that poppy syrup made the edges of insomnia more manageable, and the metaphysics of Aristotle slightly less intolerable. Surgeons packed open wounds with opium paste, hoping to dull the screaming and perhaps, if the gods were kind, help the patient survive long enough to send payment. Royalty, as expected, had access to the finest varieties. Queenly nerves were soothed with laudanum. Papal gout was eased with poppy extracts mixed with gold leaf and holy water. A sultan reportedly ingested so much opium before an audience that he nodded off mid-blessing and had to be gently nudged back to consciousness with a fan. No one dared laugh, at least not loudly. In some monasteries, the line between medicine and spiritual preparation blurred. A monk preparing to fast might take a small dose to still the flesh. A nun with stomach pains might be given syrup to settle her humours, and more importantly, prevent her from disturbing vespers with groaning. Everyone agreed it was a mercy. Most forgot to track the dosage. Poppy had its place in prayer too. Not officially, of course. The church never sanctioned intoxication, but it did sanction silence, stillness, suffering, and opium helped with all three. A monk could spend hours in contemplation, unmoved, barely breathing, his lips parting every few minutes in what might have been prayer, or simply the aftertaste of syrup. As for side effects, they were acknowledged politely, then ignored. Constipation, apathy, confusion, sudden death, these were framed as either unfortunate coincidences or evidence of the patient's weak constitution. Nobody blamed the syrup. After all, it worked. The screaming stopped. The patient smiled. For a little while, the world was tolerable. Isn't that what medicine is for? Addiction was poorly understood. Or rather, it was understood, but not taken seriously until the supplies ran out. A bishop's secretary might develop a fondness for the night tonic. A noblewoman might grow dependent on her pain powder. A scholar might find himself increasingly in need of his focusing draught. The language remained polite, evasive, and deeply unhelpful. The problem only became apparent when the poppy fields failed, or when a favoured servant dropped dead with black resin still crusted on their teeth. Doctors responded with concern, then with alchemy. Some tried to neutralise opium's more dangerous effects by mixing it with lead, or amber, or crushed emerald. Others simply suggested alternating doses with wine to keep things balanced. None of these methods worked, but they gave the impression of intervention, which was half the point. The more devout questioned whether using poppy was a moral compromise. Was relief a sin? Was pain a gift? Did numbness offend the divine? Most answered quietly, with another dose. The body may have been a temple, but it was also a sack of suffering. And temples, like people, sometimes needed a bit of reinforcement. In the Islamic world, opium also enjoyed medical prestige. Persian, Arab, and later Ottoman physicians recorded its uses with precision, noting dosages, effects, and fatal limits. Some even conducted early experiments on animals, though always in the spirit of scholarship, of course. Opium was included in most formal pharmacopoeias, noted as both a cure and a danger. It was not banned, it was respected, feared, and widely employed. A tool, not a temptation, at least until someone used it to sweeten tea and fell asleep for 2 days. The spread of opium westward came through trade, translation, and conquest, as medical texts moved from Arabic into Latin, and as crusaders returned with strange powders and stranger habits, the knowledge of poppy's power travelled with them. European apothecaries scrambled to imitate Eastern formulas. Most got it wrong. A few got it far too right. By the later Middle Ages, opium was a staple in most major city hospitals. It sat alongside leeches, cautery irons, and jars of unidentified fluid. It was the preferred remedy for difficult surgeries, persistent coughing, and troublesome patients, occasionally, all three at once. Records indicate that patients often asked for it by name, or failing that, pointed urgently at the cabinet and mimed drinking. And yet, for all its uses, opium remained poorly understood. No one knew precisely how much was too much, not until it was too late. A monk might drift into eternal rest mid-prayer. A soldier might slur his vows at a wedding and then forget he had been married. A surgeon might fall asleep in the middle of a procedure and wake to find his patient gone, or worse, still there. The dosage charts were vague. The warnings were vague. The consequences, however, were not. People died. Quietly, usually. With a faint smile, a slowed breath, and the kind of serenity that seemed almost holy until someone tried to wake them. No one blamed the poppy. They never did. The plant was beautiful. Its flowers were harmless. It was the preparation that mattered. The mixing, the measuring, the intent, or so they told themselves, as if intent had anything to do with the results in the medieval world. Not all intoxication came from brewing barrels or grinding herbs. Sometimes it came from bees, small, industrious, blameless bees, creatures rarely associated with spiritual revelation or military sabotage, until they wandered into the wrong flowers. In the forests and highlands around the Black Sea, especially in regions of Anatolia and what is now Georgia, bees pollinated rhododendrons. The flowers are beautiful. The nectar is not. Within that sweet golden liquid lies a neurotoxin called grey-anotoxin, a compound that does strange things to the human nervous system when consumed in sufficient quantities. The bees, unaware of the havoc they're about to cause, collect it anyway and return to their hives to produce what locals once called mad honey. The effects of mad honey vary, but none of them are subtle. Numbness of the limbs, slow thunderous heartbeats, sweating, vertigo, and a creeping warmth behind the eyes. Some experience uncontrollable vomiting or sudden paralysis. Others report vivid hallucinations, disorientation, and a complete detachment from physical reality. A spoonful might induce prophetic visions or ecstatic seizures. 2 spoonfuls might send you into a deep, convulsing sleep from which you might not wake at all. And yet, for centuries, people sought it out, deliberately. The honey wasn't always processed. Sometimes it was simply scraped from a hive, warm and thick, then consumed in small amounts for medicinal or mystical purposes. Local healers used it to treat hypertension and gastrointestinal disorders. Mystics used it to break open the doors of perception. Warriors, in rare cases, used it more creatively. One of the earliest and most infamous recorded uses of mad honey, as a weapon comes from 67 BCE. Roman General Pompey's forces were advancing through the Black Sea region when they encountered honeycombs left behind by locals, possibly the Heptacometes tribe. The Romans, hungry and unaware, ate freely. Within hours, they were writhing in the dirt, vomiting and crawling, their senses broken and limbs useless. The locals returned and massacred them with ease. It remains one of the more humiliating defeats in Roman military history, and possibly the stickiest. This event was not unique. Other reports, less theatrical but equally disturbing, describe small units of soldiers succumbing to the effects of mad honey on campaign. The toxin's onset is quick enough to incapacitate within hours, and long-lasting enough to disable an enemy for a full day. It's not a clean weapon, but it is an effective one, especially in a time before antidotes, intravenous fluids, or the concept of quality control. Outside of warfare, the honey found its way into homes and monasteries, often by mistake. A curious monk might sample a local jar and spend the next 6 hours weeping at the foot of a statue he believes is speaking. A noblewoman might be gifted a sweetmeat laced with the nectar, only to collapse mid-dance, clutching at her chest while the walls melt around her. These incidents were typically blamed on demons, curses, or unusually intense spiritual experiences. The bees, again, remained above suspicion. Sometimes the honey was fermented into mead. This didn't neutralize the toxins, it simply gave them a smoother delivery system. Mead, already a favorite in colder regions for its ability to warm the belly and numb the fingers, took on new meaning when made with poisonous nectar. Drinkers reported dreams that lasted days, visitations from saints or serpents, and a temporary detachment from earthly suffering. For a few, this was spiritual enlightenment. For others, it was a brush with death served in a wooden cup. In isolated communities, the honey's effects became part of local folklore. People told stories of men who saw angels in the trees or women who spoke in tongues after licking their fingers. Some claimed that consuming the honey during specific moon phases granted prophetic powers. Others simply used it to forget. In regions where famine and war came as regularly as the seasons, forgetting was sometimes the most sacred act of all. Yet for every visionary, there were those who reacted badly. A child might stumble after a bite of honey cake and never walk properly again. A farmer might collapse in the fields, his body rigid, froth on his lips, clutching the remnants of his lunch. A priest might accuse an entire village of heresy after a shared meal leaves him raving in the chapel. The line between ecstasy and agony remained as thin as a bee's wing. Authorities occasionally intervened. Local rulers banned the sale of certain honeys. Apothecaries were warned to ask about the source of their nectar. Monasteries issued polite warnings about unusual reactions in their herbal manuals. Still, the honey persisted. It was too useful, too mysterious, too compelling to fully abandon. Some users embraced the danger. Sufi mystics and ascetics occasionally experimented with the honey during prolonged fasts or devotional trances, using its effects to slip beyond the boundaries of the self. They claimed it stripped away illusion, brought clarity, dissolved the ego. Whether it brought wisdom or simply cardiovascular distress is difficult to determine, especially from a prone position. In some cases, mad honey became a form of resistance. When all other tools were denied, when weapons were confiscated, words censored, faith outlawed, the people still had bees. A little nectar, hidden in a jar, could topple a tax collector or humble an occupying soldier. It was messy, it was unreliable, but it worked just often enough to inspire stories whispered at night around fires as warnings and promises both. Modern researchers have since isolated the compounds responsible. They've written papers, conducted experiments, created dosage guidelines, but in the medieval world, such precision didn't exist. All they knew was that some honey healed and some honey turned your blood to fire. They kept eating it anyway. Curiosity, desperation, and a morbid tolerance for risk carried most decisions. It didn't help that the honey looked beautiful, thick, golden red, almost glowing in the sunlight. It clung to spoons like syrup from heaven and tasted like something just slightly forbidden. Even today, mad honey is harvested and sold in small quantities. Legal in some countries, banned in others, always accompanied by cautious warnings and enthusiastic reviews. The legacy of its power, confusion, and sweet danger lingers. As for whether it was worth it, that depended on the dose. A little made the world shimmer. A little more made the floor disappear. Anything beyond that, and you'd be hallucinating in the Black Sea region since antiquity. The medieval world was full of smoke, not just the kind that burned the lungs and blackened the walls, but the kind people deliberately inhaled, sniffed, and stewed in for reasons that ranged from vaguely medicinal to suspiciously devotional. If something could be set on fire, steeped in a broth, or crumbled into a pouch, someone would claim it calmed the nerves, softened labour pains, or opened a portal to divine truth. Sometimes it even did. Herbs were rarely eaten straight. More often they were dried, crushed, burned, or tucked into places the church didn't ask questions about. Henbane, yarrow, mugwort and wormwood, all of them common, accessible, and deeply misunderstood, were added to herbal pillows, sewn into sachets for anxious monks, or steeped in bowls to release pungent vapours. A sick room might be fumigated with them. So might a chapel. It was hard to say whether anyone felt better afterward, but the rooms certainly smelled different. In childbirth, smoke was sometimes used to drive out bad spirits or, failing that, to at least drown out the screaming. Midwives passed herbs over coals and waved the smoke toward the birth canal with solemn gestures and unspoken prayers. The effect was half spiritual, half pharmaceutical. If it worked, it was the grace of God. If it didn't, it was the devil in the mother. Either way, the smoke kept coming. Then there was the incense. Frankincense and myrrh were not just gifts for inconvenient messiahs. They were daily fare for medieval churches, and they weren't merely symbolic. Both contain mild psychoactive compounds. When burned, nothing dramatic, but enough to lower blood pressure, induce a haze, and make prolonged chanting feel a little more cosmic than usual. Step into a thickly smoked cathedral, and you might find yourself genuinely believing in angels. Step out, and the fresh air might feel vaguely heretical. This was not accidental. Medieval theologians might not have known the chemical names, but they understood the effects. Incense helped people feel reverent. It softened the sharp edges of long sermons, drowned out the smell of the unwashed faithful, and added an otherworldly filter to otherwise very worldly problems. Priests swung censers not just to sanctify the space, but to medicate it. Beyond the altar, herbal mixtures made their way into daily life in quieter forms. Herbal pillows, sometimes stuffed with lavender, hops or thyme, were used by the wealthy to encourage sleep, or at least something resembling it. For the poor, a few wilted leaves in a rag might be all they had, but the idea was the same. Breathe deep, shut your eyes and hope the night passes without a coughing fit or a visitation. Of course, not everything was restful. Henbane, when smoked or burned, had a reputation for inducing both visions and vomiting, often in quick succession. It was used for toothaches, gout and despair, sometimes all at once. One might grind it into a pipe or toss it into the hearth. If the pain didn't stop, at least the patient would forget where they were. Yarrow, meanwhile, was a catch-all. It could be chewed, brewed, burned or bathed in, depending on what you wanted it to do. It might slow bleeding, calm nerves, or encourage prophetic dreams. More importantly, it made the healer look busy. A room full of steam, chants and sharp smells often accomplished more than a single accurate diagnosis. In plague years, this practice only intensified. People carried posies or plague herbs to hold beneath their noses: lavender, sage, pennyroyal, anything believed to ward off disease. These were not just scented accessories. They were a desperate defence both against invisible death and the more immediate horror of rotting corpses. Physicians stuffed their bird-like masks with fragrant herbs, not out of superstition, but because the alternative was breathing open decay. It's easy to dismiss these as primitive traditions, but the line between religious ritual and rudimentary pharmacology was often thinner than a layer of incense ash. A priest burning frankincense believed it sanctified the air. A midwife steaming yarrow believed it summoned strength. And occasionally, both were right, at least in the sense that it made people feel less helpless, which in medieval medicine was often the only treatment available. Some herbalists believed smoke could drive out madness. Others believed it could draw it in. In one 12th century account, a woman described being healed of demonic possession after inhaling the smoke of an herb-laced fire while lying on a damp church floor. Her family insisted it was a miracle. The herbalist said it was wormwood. The church canonized nobody, but kept the recipe in case it worked again. These practices were not always voluntary. Children were sometimes forced to inhale herbal smoke for fevers or convulsions. The experience was not gentle. It stung the eyes, burned the throat, and left many more afraid of the cure than the illness. Still, some recovered. Or at least, they stopped convulsing long enough to be declared healed and sent home with a pouch of herbs to hang near the bed. The same treatments could be given to the elderly, the melancholic, the epileptic, or the inconvenient. A neighbour who screamed at the moon might be blessed with steam and prayer until they quieted. A mother with hallucinations might be pressed with bundles of mint and soothed by hymns sung through veils of resin smoke. If nothing worked, there was always confession or fire. Cultural memory is short, but the smell of certain herbs lingers in the imagination long after the science is forgotten. Many of the plants used in these rituals, henbane, rue, valerian, still appear in modern gardens, though few now would dare burn them indoors. They remain as botanical fossils, reminders of a time when survival depended not on understanding the body, but on doing something, anything, to convince it to behave. And for all its chaos, medieval folk medicine had its patterns. The poor sniffed plants and prayed. The clergy burned resins and prayed. The wealthy hired people to do both on their behalf, and then blamed the devil when it failed. Everyone agreed that the soul needed tending, but they differed wildly on what that meant for the lungs. As with most medieval treatments, dosage was a guess. A little resin might bring calm, a little more might bring visions, too much, and the only thing ascending was the patient. Smoke blurred boundaries between medicine and mysticism, between prayer and panic, between a healing ritual and a very expensive way to make the room smell worse. By the time the Renaissance began to usher in newer explanations for disease and perception, many of these old herbal rituals faded from fashion, or were repackaged as quaint curiosities. Some were quietly buried, others were banned. Still others were absorbed into religious or cultural traditions that no longer remembered why they began, only that they were comforting. And so the world moved forward, slowly, with just a little less smoke in its lungs and just as much confusion in its heart. The next great mystery, after all, would not be why people sought visions. It would be why some of them were taken so seriously. In the medieval world, where the sky was thick with theology and the ground slick with superstition, not all visions came from mouldy rye or questionable mushrooms. Some were said to come straight from heaven, or at least from someone who claimed to be on speaking terms with it. Across Christendom, the boundaries between intoxication, illness, and divine inspiration blurred like wet ink on parchment. Miracles could begin with a fever and end with canonization, or more often with a quiet burial and and an uncomfortable silence. The saints were the original celebrities of medieval Europe, revered for their spiritual insight, their piety, and, on occasion, their complete detachment from physical reality. One could see angels in the rafters, or hear the voice of Christ emanating from the bottom of a soup bowl. The key was not whether it made sense, but whether anyone else believed it. And sometimes, what they believed was that you had been chosen by God. Other times they believed you had inhaled too much incense and forgotten what your own name was. Take Catherine of Siena, for example. Famed for her mystical visions, ecstatic trances and divine dialogues, she spent much of her life in a state that, by modern standards, would require several specialists and a cautious prescription. But Catherine didn't need pills. She had fasting, exhaustion, and faith. Her visions arrived not in moments of leisure, but during intense deprivation. Weeks without food, hours of prayer, and self-inflicted discomfort designed to make the mortal coil unbearable enough for the soul to wriggle free. It was not uncommon. In fact, throughout Europe, starvation was practically a prerequisite for holiness. The closer one got to wasting away entirely, the closer one supposedly came to the divine. For female mystics in particular, this was seen as proof of purity and spiritual power. For male clerics, it was more often framed as strength of mind. Either way, the results were predictable: hallucinations, catatonia, religious ecstasy, and sometimes accidental sainthood. No one asked if you'd simply been dizzy. The chemical aids to holiness were not always accidental. Holy oils used to anoint the sick, the dying, or the newly crowned were sometimes enhanced with herbs known to produce warming, numbing, or even euphoric effects. Poppy oil was especially common, lending a certain blissful serenity to those it touched. Lavender, rosemary, and myrrh were added to bring calm, but they could also usher in vivid sensory distortions. And then, of course, there was the liberal burning of frankincense in small airless crypts, almost guaranteed to produce at least one vision per session, especially if you were already a bit fragile. For those who weren't saints but simply unwell, these substances were less inspiring. The line between miracle and madness was paper thin. A prophet might rise from a sickbed with a shining forehead and a divine message, or they might claw at the walls and scream about demons. Both were possibilities. Both had precedent. The difference often was whether your visions were comforting to those in charge or inconvenient. Some claimed that the martyrs themselves were granted numbing grace at the moment of death, that they did not feel the flames, that the rack did not tear their flesh. In hagiographies, they smile through crucifixion, sing hymns through dismemberment, and laugh as the lions approach. Whether this was divine anesthesia or just regular anesthesia is up for debate. Poppy extract could certainly help. So could trauma-induced dissociation. But neither made for very satisfying bedtime stories, so miracle it was. Monasteries and convents, meanwhile, became quiet breeding grounds for altered states. Long hours of fasting, silent prayer, and repetitive chants created an atmosphere ripe for mental detachment. Monks swayed mid-chant, not just from devotion, but from mild dehydration, caloric deficit, and the occasional herbal tea, too strong for its own good. In winter, small fires mixed with incense in poorly ventilated stone chapels, and visions arrived in curls of smoke. They were interpreted as divine. They might have just been carbon monoxide. But it wasn't all accidents and wafting vapours. Some mystics actively pursued these states. The anchorites, men and women who walled themselves into small stone cells to live a life of isolated prayer, frequently reported visions after days of fever or internal agony. Some embraced self-flagellation as a means of spiritual cleansing, whipping themselves into an altered state. Others simply stared at the same icon for so long that it began to blink back. The church's attitude was predictably inconsistent. A nun who saw the Virgin Mary might be blessed, interrogated, or quietly transferred to a more remote convent, depending on who heard the story first. If she documented her visions with poetic clarity and theological precision, she might be hailed as a mystic. If she screamed about serpents and dripping teeth, she might be labelled possessed. Both outcomes involved incense. Outside the cloistered walls, the same symptoms could lead to very different results. Villagers who fell into ecstatic trances were less likely to be canonized and more likely to be chained. Those who claimed divine communication, while lacking sufficient pedigree or a monastery's protection, were often accused of heresy or madness. It was one thing to see angels. It was quite another to say what they told you, especially if it contradicted the bishop's sermon. And yet, for all its contradictions, medieval Europe was strangely tolerant of these states as long as they were framed correctly. Pain could be divine, suffering could be holy, madness could be mystical. The body was a vessel, the world was a trial, and if someone happened to fall face first into a euphoric trance in the middle of Mass, well, perhaps the Holy Spirit had simply taken an interest. Of course, sometimes the divine visions came from outside Europe entirely. Stories travelled slowly but thoroughly, and tales of Eastern mystics, floating in meditation, speaking in riddles, wrapped in smoke, filtered westward through traders and travellers. These stories reinforced the idea that spiritual greatness and altered perception went hand in hand. Even if the methods differed, the outcomes were familiar: enlightenment, revelation, occasional drooling. In the end, there was a peculiar equality to the medieval vision. A child feverish with infection might glimpse heaven. A starving nun might hear voices. A monk surrounded by incense might weep with joy. And no one questioned the source, only the message. If the vision reinforced faith, it was divine. If it contradicted the bishop, it was madness. If it predicted good fortune, it was a miracle. If it smelled like sulphur, it was probably a demon. But in every case, the vision mattered more than the vessel. The vessel, of course, could always be replaced. And still, not everyone chose their path to euphoria. The line between medicine, poison, and potion was as blurry as a monk's handwriting after his third pint of ale. There were no warning labels, no child-proof lids, no dosage charts or controlled studies. Remedies were passed down through whispers, scribbled into marginalia, or simply observed and imitated. If something quieted the baby, it was good. If it made the goat lie down and stop screaming, even better. Survival, not science, was the governing principle. And if a few unfortunate souls collapsed into the mud along the way, well, that was simply part of the learning curve. Infants, for instance, were not exempt from the medieval desire to tranquilize life's many irritations. Quite the opposite. A wailing child in a one-room cottage, or a convent infirmary, or a plague-stricken tenement was not a sacred miracle of creation. It was an urgent problem, and the solution often came in the form of a sleep draught, a mixture of poppy syrup, aniseed, fennel, honey, wine, or anything else rumoured to soothe small lungs and larger nerves. The intent wasn't malicious, it was, in the logic of the time, compassionate. A baby that slept did not cry. A mother who slept might live another day. A village that slept didn't go mad from the sound. But the trouble with sleep potions, especially homemade ones, is that they rarely came with instructions. How much aniseed syrup was too much? How strong was the poppy infusion today? No one knew. No one measured. A drop might be a spoonful. A pinch might be half the bag. And so children drifted into uneasy drugged slumber, their dreams filled with the same herbal fog that cloaked their mothers, who had surely tasted the mixture first. Some children woke up dazed and groggy. Others didn't wake up at all. Their deaths were mourned, but rarely questioned. God had simply taken them early, perhaps to spare them the suffering of life. a merciful overdose, wrapped in theological gauze. Animals, too, wandered into altered states, though more often through curiosity than parental anxiety. Goats, as it turns out, are astonishingly poor judges of what not to eat. They sampled everything: mouldy roots, bitter leaves, fermented berries, and occasionally psychoactive fungi. A goat with wide eyes, unsteady legs, and a suspiciously blissful expression was not an uncommon sight in certain pastures. Villagers might laugh, some might cross themselves. A few might make note of which bush had caused the behaviour, just in case it came in handy later. Swine were even worse. Pigs, given access to fallen fruit, would gorge themselves into alcoholic stupor. Apples left to ferment in the autumn sun became porcine moonshine. Entire herds could be found sprawled across the orchard floor, twitching, squealing softly, and grunting in confusion as the trees spun above them. For a poor family relying on their pig for food or sale, it was inconvenient. For the pig, it was probably enlightening. Until the hangover set in. Cats had their own recreational interests, often involving herbs like valerian or catmint, which produced effects not unlike mild narcotics. A cat exposed to these substances might roll in euphoric delight, bite invisible enemies, or simply stare into space as though divinely inspired. People noticed, of course, but instead of fearing the behaviour, many attributed it to natural magic. The cat was gifted, or touched, or simply full of mystery, as cats have always insisted they are. But the crossover between human and animal remedies went both ways. In villages where apothecaries were rare and literacy rarer, the same mixtures were often given to both livestock and people. A tea that calmed a colicky baby might be poured into a trough to soothe a nervous cow. A salve that dulled the pain of a broken bone might also be rubbed into a sheep's injured flank. There was little sense of separation between veterinary and human medicine. If it grew, and it seemed to help, it was used. That was the whole system. The results were predictably inconsistent. A sick child might be given a strong herbal wine, once used on an ox with a leg infection. A dying horse might receive a poultice, meant for menstrual cramps. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it did something entirely unexpected. But in a world where divine intervention was as plausible an explanation as chemical reaction, the failures were rarely blamed on the potion. They were blamed on fate or demons or the alignment of stars. Children, like animals, were also more prone to accidental ingestion. A toddler crawling through the herb garden might find a particularly bitter leaf and chew it into mush before anyone noticed. A curious 10-year-old might taste the dregs of a monk's flask, mistaking it for spiced water. Some children ate henbane berries because they looked like candy. Others sipped wine left on altars because it was sweet and they were bored. The resulting symptoms, vomiting, trembling, hallucinations, were sometimes interpreted as demonic possession. This led to other treatments: prayer, exorcism, leeches. Rarely, if ever, did anyone say, perhaps he shouldn't have eaten that. There were cases, rare but memorable, where intoxicated animals led to intoxicated people. A goat that kept licking a certain patch of bark might be watched carefully. Eventually, a bold villager would try a bit himself. If he too began swaying, babbling, or smiling beatifically at nothing in particular, the bark might be declared interesting. Whether it was then deemed sacred, medicinal, or dangerous depended on the mood of the local priest. Dogs were sometimes used as unofficial test subjects. If a particular root or powder was rumoured to help fever, someone might mix it into a broth and feed it to an old hound. If the dog survived, wagged its tail, or showed signs of improvement, the remedy might be considered safe for humans. If the dog died or ran in terrified circles for an hour before collapsing, the dosage might be adjusted, or the entire plant avoided until someone forgot why it was banned in the first place. The problem, again, was not malice, It was ignorance. The medieval world was not full of cruel fools, but of desperate improvisers. Without modern understanding of chemistry or physiology, trial and error was the only available method. The herbs that dulled pain could also erase memory. The teas that soothed the stomach could stop the heart. A bit too much poppy milk, and a restless child became a still one. Too much fermented fruit, and the family's only ox collapsed in the field. These were tragedies, yes, but they were also shrugged off with the kind of weary fatalism that only centuries of bad luck and worse options can instill. Even in more sophisticated settings, monasteries, manors, or medical schools, children and animals remained the unintended victims of poorly understood substances. An abbey might grow mandrake for ritual purposes, but no one kept it out of reach of the novices. A nobleman might boast of a Turkish tonic that cured his gout, only to discover his hunting dogs had lapped it up and were now howling at invisible deer. It was the price of experimentation. And so the medieval world carried on, dosing its infants with sleepy herbs, letting its pigs stumble drunkenly through orchards, and watching in mild concern as goats chewed on things that made their eyes go wide. There were no disclaimers, no emergency hotlines, no national poison control centres. There was only the village gossip, the herbalist's shrug, and the occasional grave dug a little too small. Some accidents came from bottles or bark. Others came from the simple act of being alive. Because when the air stank of death, and everything you touched was rotting, even sobriety started to feel like a fever dream. By the time one reached the streets of the medieval world, the senses had already begun to surrender. There was no gentle acclimation, no easing into it. One simply stepped outside and was overwhelmed. The scent hit first, thick, cloying, persistent. A blend of open sewage, rotting meat, animal waste, smoke, and the oily sweat of bodies that hadn't known soap in weeks. Then came the visuals, crooked buildings leaning inward, like they were whispering secrets, smoke curling from every chimney, and the streets themselves a lumpy mess of mud, hay, dung, and detritus that had no name but certainly had a smell. And finally, the sounds, the shouting of vendors, the clatter of hooves, the clanging of bells, and somewhere always, a baby wailing or a dog barking at nothing. It was an environment perfectly calibrated to obliterate the modern threshold of sensory endurance. The medieval city was not designed for clarity or comfort. It was dense, layered, and constantly alive in ways that felt more threatening than charming. People lived above their animals. Garbage was thrown into the street. Rain didn't clean anything. It simply stirred the filth until it found its way into cellars, kitchens, and water barrels. Even those who lived in more rural areas were not exempt. There the air might be cleaner, but the smells of decay came closer to home. Dead livestock, damp straw, and unwashed bodies sharing a single room did not lend themselves to pastoral peace. In either setting, the result was the same: a slow erosion of the boundary between what one smelled, felt, saw, and what one imagined. The medieval diet didn't help. Bread might be laced with mould, ale might be sour, meat, if one could afford it, was often halfway to rancid and salvaged only by a generous coating of spices, if spices were available. Cheese could range from mildly pungent to aggressively alive. All of it sat heavy in the gut, which churned and bubbled in protest more often than not. Digestive discomfort was a constant companion, and when the stomach revolted too violently, one might end up purging from both ends onto a floor already streaked with worse. There was no reprieve. Food was fuel, not pleasure, and sometimes it was poison. Then there was the matter of light. For most, the sun governed life, but once it set, the world did not fall into restful darkness. It slipped into an amber-tinted half-existence. Illumination came from fire. Hearths, candles, oil lamps, These sources cast shadows that danced and shifted, turning familiar walls into flickering, uncertain terrain. Faces blurred, corners seemed deeper. A pile of clothes could become a crouching figure. A cat's sudden movement could prompt a scream. Night was not restful. It was a playground for the imagination, and the imagination was not always kind. Sleep in such conditions could be treacherous. The dreams it produced were not peaceful sojourns into the subconscious, but vivid excursions through anxiety, fever, and spiritual dread. Nightmares were commonplace, expected even. People dreamed of fire, flood, demons, and death. Some saw loved ones returned with hollow eyes. Others were pursued through endless forests by creatures with too many teeth. Many believed these visions were omens. Some thought them warnings. A few insisted they were memories of things yet to come. The mind, already frayed by diet, disease, and constant noise, offered little defence against such onslaughts. And so it began to blur the line between sleeping and waking, between the hallucinated and the real. A man who woke screaming in the night might be pitied or feared. A woman who muttered to herself in the street might be avoided or accused. Mental illness had no name, only moral interpretations. Madness was a judgment, not a diagnosis, and it was everywhere. The body did not help matters. It was, by all available accounts, a disaster. Most people lived with chronic ailments, toothaches, joint pain, festering wounds, infections that never healed but only quieted. Hygiene was inconsistent at best. Public bathhouses came and went, sometimes banned as dens of sin, sometimes celebrated as oases of cleanliness. Soap was a luxury. Warm water, rarer still. People itched, coughed, bled, and limped their way through life, wondering not if but when the next illness would come. And come it did. Disease was the great constant. Fleas, lice, and intestinal parasites were nearly universal companions. Plague stalked entire regions, leprosy disfigured, pox blistered. Even the common cold could, with sufficient malnutrition, prove fatal. Every illness came with its own bouquet of symptoms. Fever, delirium, trembling, visions. No one understood infection. Miasma theory, the belief that disease came from bad air, dominated for centuries. And in a world where air always smelled bad, everyone assumed they were constantly under threat. In times of fever, hallucinations were not just possible but expected. A child struck with a high temperature might speak in tongues. A dying man might report seeing angels. A woman writhing with childbirth complications might claim she'd flown across the rafters. No one doubted the experiences. They were either divine, demonic, or both. Medical explanations were few and unsatisfying. The line between miracle and madness was left intentionally thin, a place where saints and sinners stumbled shoulder to shoulder. Even spiritual experiences were often filtered through physical discomfort. Fasting, for instance, was common among the pious, and sometimes the poor. But prolonged fasting didn't bring purity so much as dizziness, confusion, and vivid hallucinations. Monks who starved themselves for devotion often reported encounters with the divine. Mystics described visions after weeks of prayer and deprivation. But modern understanding suggests they were also dangerously malnourished and quite possibly high on incense or contaminated bread. Still, no one asked too many questions. The vision was what mattered, not its mechanism. Children growing up in this environment were no more immune than their elders. Many knew the smell of death before they understood the meaning of the word. They saw animals slaughtered, relatives die, strangers collapse in the street. They heard sermons filled with fire and torment. They slept in crowded rooms where a cough in the night could mean nothing or the start of something very bad. Their minds formed in a world where hallucination was not exceptional. It was background noise, and the noise never stopped. Between the tolling of bells the crying of the sick, the creak of wooden wheels, and the endless clamour of human misery, the medieval soundscape was a relentless percussion of stress. Quiet was rare, stillness rarer, reflection required peace, and there was very little of that to go around. Even monasteries, for all their vows of silence, were not immune to outbreaks of mass hysteria, strange visions, or inexplicable behaviour. It was as though the entire era was trapped on the edge of something, a cliff of reason beyond which lay either revelation or collapse. There were, of course, those who claimed to embrace it. Seers, saints, mystics, and madmen all made their home on this borderland between the real and the imagined. Some inspired awe, others were beaten in the streets. All of them bore witness to the same truth, that in a world so disordered, so overwhelmed by scent, sound, hunger, illness, and fear, the mind was never wholly secure. It drifted, it cracked, it danced with shadows, and sometimes it surrendered entirely. People survived anyway. They farmed, they sang, they laughed sometimes, but the foundation was always shifting. And no matter how strong one's faith, how clean one's habits, or how sturdy one's walls, the rot was never far. It seeped into the lungs, the skin, the bread, the brain, until even the most rational man found himself staring into the firelight, unsure whether the shape in the corner was real or just a trick of heat and memory. In a world where everything smelled faintly of rot and the veil between sickness, sanctity, and simple misunderstanding fluttered thin, the line between clarity and confusion was less a line than a mist. To be medieval was to be overwhelmed by hunger, by smoke, by sermons, by silence. The body failed often, the soul more often still, and so people reached, not upward, not inward, just outward, toward the nearest leaf, root, flask, vision, or whisper that promised, however briefly, to make the world feel like less of a punishment. What were they looking for? The question feels modern. Self-help books and therapist couches? But this was not modern self-exploration. This was survival, with a slightly hallucinogenic edge. A flicker of control over an uncontrollable world. Some wanted to feel closer to the divine. Others just wanted to stop coughing. Some sought prophecy. Others wanted to pass out before childbirth. But underneath all of it, beneath the trances and tinctures and terrible side effects, was a single, universal hope that there might be a moment of relief somewhere in the chaos. They did not call it trauma, they called it life. And if that life required a few spoonfuls of poppy milk to face a sick child's screams, so be it. If it took fermented honey or herb-laced wine to dull the sound of your neighbour's death rattle, then pass the cup. If the saints only spoke when your head was splitting and your stomach on fire, then perhaps that was the price of revelation. The medieval mind did not seek intoxication as rebellion. It sought it as ritual, as medicine, as prayer with fewer rules and better results. Sometimes it worked. A difficult birth eased, a wound dulled, a mourner calmed. More often it didn't. There were spasms, infections, blindness, death. But the line between miracle and misfortune was rarely visible in the moment. And so the salves kept being made, the mushrooms kept being dried, the honey kept being harvested. Because what else was there? You couldn't ask for better gods. You could only reach for different plants. These weren't parties. There were no banners strung across village squares announcing the yearly festival of medicinal hallucination. There was no laughter echoing across plague carts. Even the drunkest feast still felt vaguely like obligation. No one really danced for joy. They danced because they hadn't died that day. These weren't celebrations. They were coping mechanisms, fermented and ground into powders, wrapped in linen, or smeared beneath the tongue by trembling hands. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it brought visions. Sometimes those visions got you canonized. Sometimes they got you arrested. The outcome depended largely on gender, geography, and whether the bishop was having a bad week. But even then the hallucinations were not questioned, only the person having them. After all, a nobleman's ecstatic dream was divine. A peasant woman's was probably witchcraft. But both were valid, so long as someone wrote them down. There is a temptation in hindsight to call it foolish, to smile condescendingly at the idea of flying ointment, or to dismiss the notion of wine-laced sermons and incense-fogged cathedrals as quaint delusion. But what really has changed? The roots have names now, chemical formulas, dosages, clinical trials. But the hunger is the same. The quiet hope that something, anything, might dull the ache, might lift the veil, might offer a glimpse of something better, even if it turns out to be a hallucinated goat in a bishop's hat. Medieval medicine, if one dares to use the term with a straight face, was often little more than controlled guessing. Some herbs calmed nerves, others caused visions. Still others did both, depending on the moon, your liver, and how much wine you'd had beforehand. But the point wasn't perfection, it was participation. A shared, stumbling attempt to reach something beyond the daily drudge of filth and theology. It was experimentation without the safety net. If it worked, you were wise. If it didn't, well, you probably wouldn't remember anyway. The religious orders tried to systematize it. The folk healers tried to simplify it. The apothecaries tried to sell it. But no one truly controlled it. It seeped through cracks, in garden plots and monastery walls, in whispered recipes passed down in kitchens, in the desperate hands of people who could no longer afford to be skeptical. To call it drug use is to miss the point. It was never about escape, it was about proximity. To God, to peace, to numbness, sometimes all at once. There were no safety labels, no disclaimers, no hotline numbers if your visions became distressing. Just a slurry of bark and alcohol, or a sniff of something sharp and burning, or a paste of seeds, an ash rubbed behind the ear with a prayer that the screaming might stop, that you might sleep, that you might wake up not feeling like your bones were made of splinters and your thoughts were drowning in fog. Even the church, stern, sober, obsessed with sin, had to make room for the inexplicable, for the visions of saints that looked suspiciously like fever dreams, for the oil that calmed more than it blessed, for the incense that made the crypts smell like something other than rot. In time, they codified the miracles, sanitized the martyrs, but the roots were still under the floorboards, the herbs were still in the garden, and the monks still drank their liquid bread with alarming enthusiasm. It is tempting to call it tragic, and in many ways, it was. Children drugged into silence, women branded as witches for the same ointments that once saved lives, men hallucinating demons where there were none, or failing to see them when they were real. But it was also, in its own twisted, root-bound, slightly drunken way, beautiful. A kind of stubborn poetry that insisted life might hold more than just plague and poverty and pain. That maybe, just maybe, the world could shimmer for a moment with something else. And if that shimmer came from fermented fruit or burning resin or a damp mushroom eaten in the dark, so be it. The outcome was often the same. Someone sitting in a corner, eyes wide, murmuring to themselves in a tone both awed and terrified. Or curled under a blanket, heart slowed, breath even, dream strange but kind. Or simply absent, gone beyond the veil and never quite returning the same. But they had gone. And that was the point. Because what they were really chasing wasn't madness, or ecstasy, or even healing. They were chasing meaning. In the smell of a flower, in the murmur of a fever, in the taste of something bitter and old and sacred. They reached through the rot and the sermons and the dirt for something, anything that might explain why the world felt like it did, why the pain never ended, why the sky didn't answer, why the dreams sometimes came true and sometimes just came to stay. Maybe they found God. Maybe they found nothing. Maybe they just passed out and woke up worse. But they kept looking, over centuries in kitchens and convents and caves, through scrolls and secrets and smoked glass. They kept looking. Because to be human is to hope that something just beyond the edge of understanding might still be waiting, merciful, or at least mildly anaesthetic. And really, what's a little blindness if it meant you laughed once that year? That brings us to the end of tonight's story. Not of heroes or revolutions, but of 1,000 forgotten souls, sniffing herbs, sipping syrups, and rubbing questionable ointments on increasingly questionable places, all in the hope of touching something divine, or at least tolerable. If you'd like early access to more of these slow unravelling histories, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with other forgotten lives and overlooked tragedies you'd like to see explored. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.